So there was this challenge, like maybe Western ethics is all built on assumptions that are patriarchal, misogynistic, and wrong. That's the feminist critique. And the feminist critique has raised some questions about how Western ethics has been thought about generally. Carol Gilligan was a psychologist, or is a psychologist, and she was colleagues with Lawrence Kohlberg, who's also a famous moral psychologist. And Kohlberg had been studying moral stages. But Kohlberg made he went out and watched people interact, deal with um, deal with each other in various ethical dilemmas, and he posed ethical dilemmas to him. And he said that he could divide up people into 6 stages. There was young kids are mostly concerned about being punished, so they obey. They don't worry about doing the right thing if they think they wouldn't be caught. And then this next stage, conventional, people want to get along. They think it's right to follow the rules. And then there's this higher level that only people generally in their 20s and over start to get to. And he thinks this is maybe 15% of the population based on his study. And they are thinking about social contracts. So, your own personal preferences could be overridden by the good of all, or they think about universal ethical principles that you should act according to. One of the interesting things is you might, now that you've studied a little Kant and Mill and Aristotle and others in this class, you might notice that thinking instrumentally about promoting good, the kind of utilitarians are in the middle. He thinks the highest form of moral reasoning is when you get to something like you're a Kantian at the end, when you work with, you're acting on a universal ethical principle. So that's an interesting, different kind of thing to notice in Kohlberg, maybe a problem. In this course, we don't ask you to study the social contract tradition, but there is a group of philosophers who are known as contractarians that think what's right is when you're acting according to a principle that would be the one that's endorsed by free and rational and equal people. So anyway, the social contract ends up being a little not quite as good as acting on ethical principles. So Kohlberg seems to many people a little Kantian, which is maybe great, depending on your perspective. But anyway, Kohlberg divided up people like this. Carol Gilligan came along and she noticed that women tended to do very poorly on that scale. Many of them were stuck at stage 3. So they were actually, when she studied them in the 1980s, and that would be really interesting to follow up and see if social changes may have led to any differences. But she noticed that women were stuck at stage 3. They weren't progressing. So they weren't fully rational in the way that Kohlberg was thinking of. And just like Mike was saying, women tended to focus on particulars, not abstract moral principles. So they weren't going to the Kantian, what is the rule I would apply that everyone should be considering in this situation, one that would be universally true. They were really trying to get not abstract away from the case to like a higher level of reasoning, but they were trying to dial down into the details, into the specific context, the specific case. And also, Carol Gilligan noted when she was studying how girls were interacting and playing, they were really interested in compromise, not following moral rules. And there was a lot of interesting stuff, like if you think of even stereotypical, elementary school, how kids play. Like Kohlberg was saying, and Carol Gilligan noted that the boys tended to play sports where there was winners and losers and rules you had to follow, and the girls tended to be more often involved in collaborative games like skipping rope, where there's not winners, everyone has to work together to make it successful. And they were interested in compromise and that sort of stuff. So this led to Carol Gilligan's important insight that maybe there's something like care that should be more seriously considered as a important ethical principle. And when she talks about care and care ethics, we're talking about, as I say here, some emotions involving a combination of sympathy, empathy, sensitivity, love. And these involve not just thinking, not getting away, putting your feelings aside so we could be rational and calculating and get to the best ethical principle, but rather this involves both our emotions and how we think. So Carol Gilligan, and then we'll talk about Mel Noddings in a second, they call for basically a new paradigm for thinking about ethics. I'll just give one other example of the difference. So especially, so we haven't talked about the contractarians, but they, if you know anything about Thomas Hobbes and his famous line that in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Like what happens in the state of nature? According to Hobbes, we all go around with clubs. We're terrified all the time. And we attack people with our clubs and take what they have, or we get attacked and need to like hang on to what we have. It's a terrible way to live. And then Hobbes thinks that's why we're grateful when the state comes in and makes us all follow laws, because we sacrifice all our freedom because we're so desperate for protection. And he thinks that's how we get, that's where our rights, him and John Locke and other people, they think our rights come from these contracts we enter into when we're worried about protecting ourselves. But some of the feminist critique of ethics has said, what if we started at a radically different place? What if instead of thinking of us alone, scared, out in fields, living with our clubs, we thought about the most important relationship as a mother and child? If we started there, would we think differently about ethics? And so let's think about the mother's interaction with a child. Is the mother motivated by fairness, justice, self-interest, a contract with socially beneficial rules, impartial benevolence to her child and all other children? No. We understand that for our own particular child, we are called upon to have important responses that help that child flourish. It's actually selfless and it's not impartial. We're not trying to treat every child the exact same. We have a partial duty to our own child, not all others. And if we think about the root of our moral duties, if we start there rather than like this other example I gave in the state of nature, we might have a really different ethical framework to think about. So Nell Noddings was the philosopher that really takes Carol Gilligan's theory and develops it further. This was her seminal book in the field, Caring Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education. And she also said, like, historically, ethical theories ignore or denigrate virtues associated with women. Instead, they jump to abstract reasoning and partiality and that sort of thing. But let's just think about, she says, how we actually have to respond to the people that are most important in our lives, our children, our family members. We start there, we could think differently about ethics. So a care ethicist like Noddings would foreground cooperation rather than competition. Also, there's much made of rights in traditional Western ethics. And when you talk about rights, you demand that those rights be respected, because that implies ideas of independence and the need to protect a person's autonomy. Whereas care ethicists wouldn't necessarily say that's wrong, but they'd say, why don't we start with the emphasis on connectedness, like how we matter to each other. So rather than demanding rights, let's think about how we actually relate most of the time and in our most important relations to other people. And then most moral theories, they think about abstraction, they move to impartiality. So an example we could think of, and I think I mentioned this one when we talked about Mill last week, but Peter Singer had a famous article where he talked about what if you walked by a pond and you saw a child drowning in the pond and you were wearing some nice clothes that you didn't want to get dirty, we would think it was uh, pretty obvious that most people would sacrifice making their clothes dirty in order to save a child's life. So he moves to the next step of thinking, well, if it's true that without considerable cost to oneself, we could do something that would really benefit others, why would we think it's more important to help a child drowning near us when halfway across the world there may be thousands, tens of thousands of children starving, and we could help one or more of them with equally little to sacrifice for just, in US dollars, few dollars, $10, whatever we care to, anything would make a huge difference, especially in countries where with extremely low cost of living and high rates of famine. So, so for the utilitarians, modern utilitarians like Peter Singer, it's obvious we should move to impartiality. We shouldn't prefer the child drowning in front of us to helping one that's just further away just because they're further away. Care ethicists raises a challenge to this kind of idea that you actually do have to appreciate the specifics of a situation. We should be partial to our own children, our own family, the people closest to us. And it's only the mistake of thinking of moving to impartiality and thinking of impartiality as an uncomplicated, unproblematic virtue that would cause us to think it would be better to treat everyone the exact same. We do have special duties to people in our lives who we are close to and who are most important to us.